When I started writing this, I assumed that supercommunicators were people who are like really charming and gregarious and outgoing extroverts. And what I found and what the data says is that's just not true. Supercommunication, our ability to communicate, it is not an inherent characteristic. It's just a set of skills. And that literally anyone can learn these skills. Anyone can learn to ask deep questions, to practice it until it becomes a habit, which will happen very, very quickly. And then they start becoming a supercommunicator.
So you write in the book that whenever we speak, we're actually participating in one of three conversations: practical, what's this really about? Emotional, how do we feel? And social, who are we? So how does one identify the type of conversation they are having? This blew my mind.
Well, it's a really good question. And it's important to understand the reason why identifying which question you're in is helpful. Is because if you're not having the same kind of conversation as the person you're talking to, it's very hard to connect. This actually came out of my own experience before I started writing this book. And the reason I wrote the book is I would come home from work and I got into this bad habit with my wife, and we've been married for 20 years. And I would come home from work and I'd start complaining about my day, and she would offer really practical advice, like really good advice. Like, why don't you take your boss out to lunch and you guys can get to know each other a little bit more? And instead of being able to hear what she was saying, I would get even more upset, right? I would be like, why aren't you supporting me? You're supposed to be on my side. And she would get upset because I was attacking her for giving me good advice. And pretty much everyone who's listening has had the same pattern exist in their life at one point or another in their relationships. And so when I went to experts and I asked them what's going on here, what they said is, look, when you're coming home, you're having an emotional conversation. You're talking about how difficult your day is. And your wife is responding with a practical conversation. She's giving you advice. And those are both totally legitimate types of conversations. But unless you're having the same kind of conversation at the same moment, you can't really hear each other. You can't really connect with each other. And so the question you asked is really a powerful one, which is, so how do we figure this out? How do we know what kind of conversation is happening here? Part of it is just understanding that there's different conversations and making yourself sensitive to it, right? Listening for those clues that someone is feeling emotional or someone is feeling the social. They want to talk about interactions with other people. Is sometimes we can do it just by asking, right? When I come home and I start complaining about my day, my wife often will say now, "What do you want me to come up with solutions for this? Or do you just need to vent and complain and get this off your chest?" And it's actually a huge relief to have her ask that, because then I say like, oh no, this isn't that big a deal. Like I just want to complain. Like, just listen to me complain for a little while. And then sometimes we have to ask questions. And one of the things that we know about consistent supercommunicators is that they ask like 10 to 20 times as many questions as the average person. And in particular, they ask a kind of question that's known as a deep question, which asks people about their values or their beliefs or their experiences, which can sound kind of intimidating, but it's as simple as like if you meet a doctor, instead of saying, "Where do you practice medicine?" asking, "What made you decide to go to medical school?" And when we ask those deep questions, we're inviting the other person to tell us what kind of conversation they want to have. And they'll often tell us.
In your experience, is there usually a winner in the practical versus emotional and social? If you meet someone for the first time, is it split? 33% want to have the practical, 33% the emotional, 33%.
And what's important is that every great discussion actually contains all three kinds of conversations, right? It's not that we start emotional and we stay emotional. It's that my wife says, "Do you want to complain or do you need advice?" And I say, "Oh, I just need to complain." And I complain to her for the next couple of minutes and she empathizes and we have an emotional. And then she says, "Hey, like, would it be okay if I suggested a solution?" And we move into the practical conversation together. And then we might talk about, how this relates to our kids or how I relate to other coworkers, which is a social conversation. So it's not that one is more important than the other or one is more dominant than the other, or it's that once we become aligned, we can move through the different conversations together. And it's that movement through the conversations together that makes us feel connected.
And so how does one create that meaningful conversation in a setting which for many is awkward? I'm at an event, I'm at a party with a bunch of strangers and I need to break the ice and I actually want to have maybe a meaningful conversation. Walk us through how one should approach that.
I can do it with you. Let's say we meet at a party and I say to you, "Hey, Jason, where do you live?"
I live in Miami, the greatest city in the world.
Oh, right. Like, tell me about, like, why do you think, why, it sounds like you probably moved there. Why did you decide to move to Miami? What was it about Miami that made it interesting for you?
Well, we've my wife and I have a long history with Miami. We had our second date here. We got engaged here. We went on our mini moon here. We don't like the winter, so we found ourselves coming down here 2 to 3 times a year from New York. We don't like the cold. We love the culture here, and really love the sunshine and the community. And when it became clear that this was a possibility that we could leave Brooklyn and we could actually work from here, we said, why don't we do that? And we found a lovely school for our two girls, and the stars aligned, and the rest is history.
So think about how much you just told me, right? Not only did you tell me all these facts, you told me that you're married, you have two kids, but more importantly, that family is really important to you, right? That like this wasn't for your career. This was because a decision that you guys made together for your family. You told me that you really like other cultures. Like you like to dip into other cultures, to learn from other cultures, that you're not looking to live in Connecticut where everyone looks exactly like you. That in fact, one of the things you like about Miami is that it has this vibrant culture that's interesting to you. You told me that you care about your kids and you care about your kids' education. And there's probably a series of values that I can read into that. That you're someone who likes to read. That you're probably someone who takes school seriously. Like I just asked you one kind of simple question: why did you move to Miami? And you told me so much about who you are. But more importantly, you told me what kind of mindset you're in, right? That you're sharing, you're interested in exploring who you are and learning about who I am. That's a social conversation. It's about how we relate to each other. It's really easy to ask a deep question if we just try.
It's a great question. When someone's new to an area, the why question, I think, is going to get a really solid answer and take the conversation in a positive way. But how would you approach the conversation you have, say, with the barista at a Starbucks or whatever coffee shop you go to?
So, and let me just say, you don't have to have a conversation with everyone, right? Sometimes when I'm at the coffee shop, I just want to get my coffee, or sometimes I get into the Uber and I don't want to talk to the driver. But when you do want to have a conversation, when you're in that mood,
100%. Why I'm hitting on this one specifically is I believe that the younger generation, probably not most of our listeners, I do know that they've lost this art of having a conversation. And I want to segue to texting and social media and so forth, but the ability to confront a stranger and actually have a meaningful conversation, we all know how important that is to our well-being.
And I actually disagree a little bit, and I'll explain why in a second. But let's say that we are in that situation where we get into the taxi or we get into the Uber and the driver's there and we want to have a conversation, or we're waiting for a coffee and there's a couple of minutes and the barista's just standing there. Sometimes like the easiest thing to do is just to be like, hey, do you like working for Uber? What's it like? Do you like working at this coffee shop? Or what's your favorite part of working here? Right? And inevitably, like they're going to say something kind of interesting and real. And maybe they don't want to have a conversation. Maybe they're like, I like the tips. Here's your coffee, right? You shouldn't force a conversation on them. But if you're in a situation where you both want to have a conversation, instead of asking them about the facts of their life, if you ask them how they feel about their life, that will inevitably be a deep question. It will inevitably invite them to say something meaningful and real. Now, to the thing that you mentioned about the younger generations, where there is this concern that they have lost the art of conversation or knowledge how to have conversations. One thing to keep in mind is that it's actually very important to try and recognize that not all conversations look the same to us as the conversations we have. One of my favorite examples of this is about 100 years ago when phones first became popular. There were all these articles that appeared that said, no one will ever have a real conversation on a telephone, right? Because up till then, all conversations had basically happened face to face. And there were all these people who said, look, if you can't see each other, you're not going to have a real conversation. And we're really worried about the state of conversation because now instead of going to someone's house, they're just going to call them up. And what's interesting is at that moment, all those concerns were actually right. If you look at the early transcripts of people having telephone conversations, they basically didn't know how to use them. They used them like telegrams. They would use them to send each other grocery lists or stock orders. But then, of course, like by the time you and I are teenagers and everyone listening is a teenager, you could talk on the phone for 7 hours a night and it was the most meaningful conversation of your life. Now, to our parents, it might look like wasted time, but we knew that we were connecting with people. And this is what's important about what's happening today. There are some aspects of screens and online activity that are worrisome, right? If you're not having a conversation, if you're watching TikTok or YouTube, you're just watching videos, you're playing video games all by yourself, that's not learning how to connect with other people. But if you are having conversations over text messages or Snapchat, if you're playing a video game and you have your headphones on, like my sons do, and you're talking to 10 of your best friends who are also playing the same game in their own living rooms, you're actually learning how to have conversations. And in fact, in some ways, our kids are better at having some kind of conversations than we are. Anyone who's listening who has a teenager, ask your teenager to show you some of their text messages that are just emojis. And then ask them to decipher what the emojis say. And what they'll explain to you is that they have emotional conversations over text using emojis. Now, most of us, we don't know how to have an emotional conversation over a text message, right? Or if we do it, we have to like spend forever typing with our thumbs. What's happening right now is that modes of communication, channels of communication are changing. But that doesn't mean we aren't learning how to communicate. It just means that that communication looks different. And that when we nudge our kids, we shouldn't say, put away your phone, never talk to your friends on your phone, just talk to them face to face. What we should instead say is, don't do things that are solitary. Don't just look at Instagram or YouTube or TikTok. Have conversations. And however you do that, it's okay.
How do you, when using text specifically to communicate with someone, in my view, what gets lost, you mentioned the emojis, the emotion, the context can often be difficult, especially when the conversation is more than, what time are we meeting for dinner or what the weather is like. Do you have any thoughts or tips on how, like watch outs, if you will, when communicating on text so things don't get lost in translation and maybe interpreted the wrong way?
Well, I think what's important is to recognize that different forms of communication have different rules and different strengths and weaknesses, right? So you take sarcasm. We all know intuitively that if I'm talking to you and I say something sarcastic, you can hear the sarcasm in my voice and it's fine. We also all know that if I type something sarcastic, there's a pretty good chance you're going to take it seriously and you're going to get upset. And so whenever we take a second, we just remind ourselves, okay, if I have something sarcastic to say, it's probably better to call the person than to email the person, right? Or just to like let the sarcasm go and not try and use it right now.
I feel like that should be like in the handbook.
Yes, it is. It is in the yeah. And the thing is that like, it's not that some forms of communication are inherently bad. It's that some forms of communication have different strengths and weaknesses and rules. And so if I need to coordinate with my wife who's picking up the kids after school, text is great. If I need to talk to her about, something in our marriage that's important, then I probably should sit down and write an email or wait till we're face to face. But that doesn't mean, frankly, that we couldn't still have that conversation over text. It just means that we would have to work harder at it.
So in terms of having that conversation with your spouse, what have you learned over the years, whether it's your spouse or your partner, to avoid?
Oh, I think both of us could probably come up with a long list of things that we've learned to avoid, right? Like, for instance, some questions that are asked are not actually questions. If they ask, do you like the dinner I cooked for you? They're not actually looking for critical feedback. They're looking for you to say, you are amazing. Thank you so much for cooking. And we're the same way, right?
Well, I think the emotional, practical one is really an important one. When you said that really hit home. Sometimes it goes for both of us. Sometimes someone's just looking to vent and they're not looking. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm very solutions oriented. And sometimes my wife, who also happens to be my co-founder and co-CEO, isn't looking for a solution at the moment. I just want a listener.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And oftentimes the best thing we can do is to ask, right? In schools, they teach this method to teachers that when a student comes up and they have something important they want to talk about, that the teachers just start the conversation by saying, do you want to be helped? Do you want to be hugged? Or do you want to be heard? Which are the three kinds of conversations: the practical, the emotional, and the social. And the reason why that's so powerful is because you don't know what the other person wants, particularly if they're a kid, until you ask them. But once you ask them, they can tell you immediately what they're looking for. And I think the same thing is true of relationships, right? In many of the best relationships, they spend a certain amount of time talking about how they communicate. And I'm sure you do this with your wife. I do it with my wife. Everyone who's listening spends some amount of time saying, if you have something to tell me and it's like this, I think you should do it this way. Here's how I love to get advice from you. Here's how I love to hear something that's kind of hard to hear from you. The more we talk about how we communicate, the easier the communication is. And so when it comes down to that emotional versus practical, it's sometimes just a matter of taking a step back and saying like, oh, like Liz is saying something, and in my head, she's asking me for advice. But let me just check to make sure she's actually asking me for advice, because I know I've gotten this wrong in the past. And so you can just ask.
When you brought up the example of the child in a school helped, hugged, or heard, what do you think of reflective listening?
You mean where you sort of repeat back what someone has said?
Yeah, as like a method to like build a connection. And
so there's actually a technique that sort of draws on that I like a lot, that they teach at like Harvard Business School and Stanford, a bunch of other places. And it's particularly useful for conflict conversations. So one of the things that happens in almost any conversation, but particularly a hard conversation, is that there is part of our brain that is always suspicious that the other person is not actually listening to us, but is just waiting their turn to speak. And so it's really important in many situations to prove that we're listening. And we think that the way we can prove we're listening is how we behave while someone is speaking, right? We look at them in the eyes, we nod our head up and down. But the thing is, what studies have shown is that speaking is such a cognitively intense activity, we often don't notice how our audience is reacting. So we don't pick up on the fact that they're listening. So what's really important to prove that you're listening, particularly during a tough conversation, is what you do after the person stops talking. And then there's this method known as looping for understanding. And it's very similar to reflective listening. It has 3 steps. The first step is ask a question, preferably a deep question. Second step is, once they have answered that question, repeat back what you heard them say, but in your own words. The goal here is not mimicry, it's matching. It's showing that you have actually been paying attention, and more importantly, that you have been processing what they're saying to you. It's not just like, oh, what I heard you say is repeat the same thing. It's what I hear you say is this is really bothering you and you need me to come in and be more of a support to you. And then the third step, and this is the one we always forget, is ask if you got it right. Because one of 2 things is going to happen. Sometimes you don't get it right, right? Like sometimes you actually misheard what the person said and they're like, no, that's not what I meant. But sometimes they say, oh yeah, no, you heard me. And what we're actually doing in that moment is we're asking them for permission to acknowledge that we were listening. And there's this thing hardwired into our brains that when we believe someone is listening to us, we become more likely to listen to them in return. And so this reflective listening is actually really, really helpful as long as it's not this inauthentic attempt at manipulation. It has to be something where you're really paying attention, you're really trying to show that you're processing this, and then you're asking in a genuine way, am I getting this right? Or is there something I don't understand?
So would that be effective? Where I was going next, you mentioned manipulation. It's persuasion. How do you think about persuasion?
Oh, I mean, so one of the things that we know is that the people who are most persuasive are the people who ask the most questions and listen best, right? If I'm trying to persuade you to like sign up for my newsletter and I don't know that you don't even have an email account, it doesn't matter how persuasive I am. I'm not going to be able to sell you on it, right? If I'm trying to convince you to buy my steak and you're a vegetarian, it doesn't matter how persuasive I am. So the most important thing we can do.
They should buy the steak and they should sign up to your newsletter. So, we're there. You got the right audience.
But luckily I don't even sell steak. But what's really important is if I want to be persuasive, I should start by asking you, what is the criteria by which you make decisions? What's important to you? And then at that point, I should probably share something authentic about myself. There's this kind of concept that like supercommunicators or people who are really good at this, they're really good at like being con men or like manipulating you. The truth of the matter is, study after study shows it is really, really hard to manipulate another person, right? It's not something you can do just through like silver-tongued sophistry. Our brains are like have a hair trigger to try and detect inauthenticity. And so what's what's important is if you are trying to persuade someone, and there are times when we try and persuade lots of people, what's important is to be authentic and to acknowledge that like sometimes it will work and sometimes it won't.
Jason Walkup here, founder and co-CEO of MindBodyGreen and the host of the MindBodyGreen podcast. Please subscribe. You'll never miss a show and you won't regret it. You know, it's funny, what came across to me in the book is being really curious is a quality that's going to take you very far in terms of being a super communicator.
And it's not hard to be curious, right? And we can detect when someone is inauthentically curious. We've all been at that party where someone has asked us, "Where'd you go on vacation?" And we realize about 20 seconds in, they don't care where we went on vacation. They just want to tell us where they went on vacation and like the fancy yacht they rented. Like we know when curiosity isn't real, but the truth of the matter is all of us carry around a huge amount of curiosity. It's just about tapping into that and letting that out. And being okay asking these deep questions, saying to someone like, why did you decide to become a doctor? Like what, or why did you decide to move to Miami? Like when we let that curiosity out, when we ask questions that are genuine, other people love answering them. It feels good.
The opposite of feeling good post-conversation is the difficult conversation, delivering bad news. How any tips for how we can do better there?
So in those situations, that looping for understanding is really important, right? We have to prove that we're listening. But the other thing that oftentimes makes those conversations difficult is two things. The first is oftentimes we have this anxiety going into a conversation like that makes it really stressful. And what's interesting is the anxiety mostly exists because of the unknown. I'm going to say this thing and I don't know how you're going to react. Or I'm going to ask you a question and I don't know how you're going to answer. And that unknown makes me very, very anxious. And as a result, I bring that anxiety into the conversation and you pick up on it right away. So one of the things that we can do is we can try and manage that anxiety by removing the unknowns. And there was a study that was done by Harvard Business School professors where they asked a bunch of students, they told a bunch of students, look, you're going to go have a conversation with a stranger, which is like the most anxiety producing thing that we can ask someone to do. And they said, before you do, just take like 10 seconds, write down 3 topics you might want to talk about. Right. And they were dumb topics like, have you seen the new movie? Are you going to the party this weekend? You know, I grew up nearby. And so people did this. They wrote out 3 topics and then they put it in their pocket and then they went and they had the conversation. And afterwards, the researchers asked them, how'd that conversation go? And all the students said the same basic thing. They said, those topics I wrote down, they actually never came up. Like we talked about other stuff. But I felt so much more relaxed and so much more at ease and so much more confident in the conversation because I knew that I had these 3 things in my pocket. Like if there was an awkward silence, I knew what I was going to ask about. And this gets to how we prepare for difficult conversations. We prepare for them. And oftentimes when we prepare, what we do is we think exclusively about what we want to say and the hard part, right? I want to tell this person that like they're not doing their enough or I'm angry at them. But the way that we should prepare is in addition to thinking about what we want to say, we should also think about what we hope the other person will say. And what questions we can ask to make it easy for them to say that. How we invite them into the conversation. That removes a lot of the anxiety and a lot of the challenge of that discussion because now we have kind of a plan. And it's not just a plan about like, I want to get my point across. It's a plan about how we communicate with each other.
Yeah, it's interesting. And something I've found to be successful advice given to me a long time ago when having a difficult conversation is setting the stage, letting the person know, hey, this is going to be a difficult conversation, or look, we're going to talk about something that I know you're not going to like, and like pause, like get like, or, you know, are you the cliche, are you sitting, you know, take a moment, and that still going to be a difficult conversation, but allows that person that moment to kind of brace themselves and have less of an impact, if you will.
I think another thing that we can do, that's really good advice. And what the research shows is that in addition to doing that, sometimes it's really, really useful, particularly when we're talking about topics that are social topics like race or politics, to say something like, this is going to be a tough conversation. It's going to be awkward. And I want you to know that, like, that's okay. And I might say the wrong thing. Like, sometimes the gap between my brain and my lips is big enough that I mean to say something and it's going to come out the wrong way. And I hope you'll forgive me. And by the way, if you say something in the way that you don't mean, I promise you, I won't take immediate offense. I will try and understand what you're actually saying. Right. And what we're really doing is we're saying, look, communication is hard. like we're both coming into this conversation recognizing that it's hard. Like, we're going to try and have a little bit of grace for each other.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. I'm sure you know Scott Galloway.
Yeah.
So we've had Scott on the show. Scott was in Miami. He spoke at an event, and Scott's amazing. And before he started speaking to this group, he said, I'm going to say things you may not like, that are going to be controversial. And I ask you that, this be a space where, you listen and you're forgiving. And wouldn't it be great if we operated like that? And I thought, he was amazing. He did definitely say things that I'm sure people in the audience did not like, but I thought, wow, isn't that wonderful? And that's so difficult to do. I don't want to criticize social media. Like, there's a lot of good there, but you just can't have that conversation. You can't say that like, hey, I'm going to go on Twitter and say something you're probably not going to like, but here it is.
Well, and it's interesting because I think one of the things that happens when we do that is that it clarifies what the goal of a conversation is, right? The goal of a conversation is not for me to convince you that I'm right and you're wrong. It's not even for us to necessarily agree with each other. It's not for me to try and convince you that you ought to like me or that I'm smart. Or the goal of a conversation is simply to understand each other, right? I want to understand how you see the world. I want to speak in a way that you can understand me. And that does not mean that we will agree with each other. But if we walk away from that conversation actually understanding each other a little bit better, then that conversation has been a complete success. Because we've managed to form some connection. And inevitably, out of that connection, we will find things that we agree on. We will find things, or I'll just acknowledge that, like, I see the world differently than you, but the way you see the world is legitimate. I might not agree with it. I might not like it, but I understand that, like, you're not like evil or dumb. And I think that's what Scott's doing when he does that, is he's saying, look, the goal of this is not to try and get you to agree with me. The goal of this is not for us to try and prove to each other that we're, one of us is smart and one of us is dumb. The goal of this is to try and understand each other. And as long as we understand each other, even if we walk away saying that person's an idiot, then we have had a successful conversation. We've done something good.
Yes. I've been thinking about the first question you asked me about why I moved to Miami. And how that question, the moving to a city question, is such a powerful question. And it allows you to go deep pretty quickly. And something my wife and I have loved about being in Miami is, and I'm like a lifelong New Yorker. We lived in Dumbo for 13 years. Have so many friends here in Miami and have made more meaningful connections than we ever did in New York. And what's interesting is there's almost an expat community, if we will. Most of our friends here in Miami, they came from New York, LA, San Francisco, Chicago.
As many people have said to me, the wonderful thing about Miami is that it's so close to the United States.
Where I'm going with this is, I think it's not necessarily we're all expats and there's this some sense of shared values, although I think that probably plays a role. It's the conversation quickly went to a more meaningful place, deeper, because you got to know people. Oh, you moved? Why did you move? So right away, we jumped into these meaningful conversations very quickly and were able to forge great friendships.
Yeah. Yeah. And you were probably on the same sort of wavelength, right? You were having the same kind of conversation at the same moment. Yeah. I lived in New York
but you can go there so quick. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I lived in New York for 14 years and I love New York. And I actually found one of the things that I loved about it was that people were much more open about their neuroses in New York. There's kind of like a prideful neuroses, like, oh, which antidepressant are you on, and what are you anxious about? And that is, it's very vulnerable, and so as a result, it's very endearing, and you can feel very close to people. But the other countervailing thing is that people spend so much time working and thinking about work that oftentimes it's hard to get out of the practical conversation. Oftentimes you're in this mindset where you're just thinking about practical topics. And I think that in other places, and I live in Santa Cruz, California, where you have more time, you can have different kinds of conversations. Someone said this thing the other day that I loved. They said, for leaders, there is no hack for time, right? It does not matter how great a leader you are. If you do not spend time with someone, you really can't connect with them. And I think places that allow us to spend time with other people, those are places that allow us to develop real relationships.
Have you found it's been easier to make meaningful relationships happen in Santa Cruz compared to New York?
In Santa Cruz? Yeah. I mean, so the answer is yes and no, because the thing that I love about New York is you move to New York to spend time with other people who have moved to New York, right? There's like this self-selection of like ambition and curiosity and energy. And so the people who move to New York, it's like, it's like the moths to the light bulb, and the light bulb has a special frequency to attract some of the most interesting, dynamic, contrarian people. And when you're outside of New York, and I'm curious if you've discovered something similar, there's fewer of those people around, right? Because a lot of them are in New York and less outside of New York. But the difference is that when you meet them here, you actually have time to develop a relationship with them. I had great friends in New York that I would see once every 2 months tops. And that was like seeing them on a regular basis. And again, there's no hack for time. Like, the wonderful thing here is sometimes it's harder to find the people that I really feel connected to. But once I do, I actually get to be connected to them.
So, of all the research you came across while writing the book, what really stood out? What was the most surprising?
So I think there was two things. The first is, when I started writing this, I assumed that supercommunicators were people who are like really charming and gregarious and outgoing extroverts. And what I found, and what the data says, is that's just not true. Like, basically, there are some supercommunicators who are charming, and there's some who are curmudgeonly, and there's some who are extroverts, and there's some who are introverts. That supercommunication, or our ability to communicate, it is not an inherent characteristic. It's just a set of skills, and that literally anyone can learn these skills, right? Anyone can learn to ask deep questions, to practice it until it becomes a habit, which will happen very, very quickly. And then they start becoming a super communicator. Anyone can learn to almost loop for understanding and show that they're listening almost instinctually, habitually. So that's the first thing that like was really powerful to me, is that we are all good at conversation. We're all good at communication. We just need to sometimes learn what the skills are to let them out. But then the second thing relates to this study that was done called the Harvard Study of Adult Development. Sometimes it's called the Happiness Study. It's been going on for about 80 years now. And the original goal of it was to try and identify what are the characteristics that make someone live longer than other people. So longevity. And then it began expanding, and it became about not only live longer, but also be happier as they age and be more successful, however you happen to define success. And so for about 80 years now, they followed around thousands of people, like studying their lives. And what they found is that the only reliable predictor of being healthy at age 65, happy at age 65, and successful is having at least a handful of close relationships at age 45, which oftentimes means you've had them for a number of years, right? What we know is that we are social creatures, and the only way we can actually really be deeply happy is by connecting with other people, by having real meaningful connections. And that when we are happy that way, it actually makes us healthier. We end up living longer simply because we know other people. The Surgeon General has said that being lonely is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And not only that, but it makes us more successful because there's all these opportunities that we don't come across on our own, but that other people tell us about. And the way that we become closer to others is through conversations. It doesn't mean that we have to have conversations every day or every week or even every month. But it does mean that if there is someone special in your life, you should set up a time at least once a year and set aside an hour and a half to call them and catch up and know and acknowledge that the first 10 minutes are going to be kind of awkward because you're going to be like trying to like, just tell each other about what your kids have done. And it's hard to get into the flow of things again. But after you get over those first 10 minutes, it's going to be magical. And that actually that phone call once a year, that is not only going to make you happier, it's going to make you healthier. And that's really valuable.
Agreed. So other than buying the book, which is amazing, Super Communicators, I'll hold it up for those on YouTube, and signing up for your newsletter, we'll put the link. You're not selling steak yet, but we will work on that. Any other tips or words of wisdom or anything else you'd like to touch on before we let you go?
No, except that, if I would love to hear from people, like, I put my email address in the book at the end of the book and expressly invite people to reach out to me. And every email I get, I read and I respond to from readers and listeners. And what I would say is, this can seem like a lot sometimes when people try and break it down, like, oh, there's 3 kinds of conversations and you should loop for understanding. You should ask deep questions. But communication is our superpower, right? As a species, like communication is why we've been so successful. And our brains have evolved to be really good at communication. And so if you set a goal of yourself, I'm going to ask one deep question a day. I'm going to loop for understanding once a week with my spouse. What you'll find is your brain makes it into a habit very, very quickly. And once it's a habit, you do it almost effortlessly without thinking about it. And that's when you can really connect with other people because it feels easy.
Do you have, on that note, we'll close with this. Do you have a go-to deep question?
No, I actually don't. I mean, usually I just ask some version of why. There is this experiment when I give a lot of speeches, and when I give a speech, there's an experiment that I like to do that's been done by academics, where I ask everyone in the audience to turn to the person next to them, preferably a stranger, and ask and answer one question, which is, when is the last time you cried in front of another person?
Oof.
And then I ask, who's enthusiastic about this? And nobody raises their hand, right? This does not seem like a good idea. And then later on, after I explain why this is a good idea, we do the experiment and people won't shut up. They love it. They say it's one of the best conversations they've had in the past month. And what I carry away from that is it almost doesn't matter what your deep question is. What matters is asking a deep question, right? Asking something that feels like you're actually asking this person, who are you? Tell me about how you see the world. Like for you, it's like, why did you move to Miami? That obviously was a big decision for you. But it could also be, why are you an entrepreneur? Or what do you, what attracted you to your wife? Why do you think your marriage works? What matters less than the actual question is the spirit behind it. The spirit of, I want to understand who you are. Will you share with me?
Great one for a couple. How did you meet?
Exactly. Works every time.
Thank you so much. Congratulations on the book.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me on.